Hi, and thanks everyone for joining us for the third webinar of our Spotlight series on research policy partnerships. My name's Sarah Ely, and I'm the Senior Project Officer in the Capacity Building space at Health Translation SA, and I'm your host for this series. This is the second to last week, we've got one final one next Thursday. I'll start by acknowledging that the Kaurna people are the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, which my feet are on. I recognise their cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection to the land. I honour and pay my respects to the Kaurna elders, past, present and to the future. I imagine a lot of us are in Kaurna lands today, but feel free to pop in the chat if you're zooming in from somewhere else. So the Spotlight series, it's an initiative launched by HTSA, and it's a way to build knowledge and capacity in a range of essential research translation topics. So we do this through month-long focused education initiatives, which include 4 online webinars, and we hear from a range of experts. This is our 7th series, and the previous ones have covered topics such as implementation science, research impact, community engagement, the MRFF, health economics, and the last one was patient-reported measures. So the previous recordings, they're all up on our website if any of those topics are of interest. And Health Translation SA, I'll just briefly explain who we are. We're an NHMRC accredited research translation centre, and we seek to connect health researchers and health services with the right stakeholders and partners to accelerate the implementation of research discoveries. And you can see down the bottom of this slide all of our partners, and this encompasses the breadth of health service delivery across South Australia. And we work with our partners and other stakeholders as an independent catalyst to broker to mobilise collaborations that address major health system challenges. And we do this through a variety of ways, but education and training, this is where the Spotlight series falls under. So to today's webinar, we're going to be hearing from Julianne Mitchel and Dr. Beck O'Hara. And they'll be providing 2 success stories of how advocacy has led to changes in government policy and funding success. And I suspect their stories are going to be quite different and showcase that there isn't necessarily a prescriptive formula for how to work with government and how to influence policy. So I'm just going to introduce each of our speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over to Julianne for her to share a screen and start her presentation. Julianne, she's an experienced, purpose-driven health leader, having worked in both government and non-government organisations. She's managed highly skilled and experienced teams. She's overseen successful state and national public health programs and has been a regular media commentator on chronic disease prevention and women's health. Her advocacy skills have been honed into the policy areas of tobacco control, public health, nutrition, primary prevention and women's health. Then to Dr. Beck O'Hara. Beck's an endometriosis researcher specialising in digital health research. Her PhD focused on people's experiences of endometriosis and the role of self-management. And she currently coordinates the EndoZone project, which is a co-created digital endometriosis platform funded by the Australian government. She has 15 years of experience working in chronic disease research and evaluation in government industry, not-profit and academic settings. So Julianne and Beck will each present for about 20-25 minutes each, and so we should have time for a bit of Q&A at the end. If you have any questions throughout their presentations, feel free to pop it into the Q&A chat and we'll see how many I get to at the end. But just to flag that Beck has to leave straight after her presentation. So if you have any specific questions to her, I'll put them to her in email later and we'll get back to you. So Julianne, I'm going to stop sharing. So if you would like to take over. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, great. Where's my presentation gone? Here we go. Oh, is it coming up for you?
Not quite yet.
Okay. Okay. Not sure why it's not coming up.
So maybe just try pressing the share screen button again and see if that takes over.
Okay. Oh, I apologise for this.
No, these things happen.
We trialled it before and it worked.
I know, works fine in the practice environment.
Beck, Sarah, do you think you could bring up my presentation and I might just get, I'll ask you just to forward it if that's okay, to forward the slides.
Oh, Julianne, I'm sorry, that didn't actually come through in the email.
Oh, didn't it? Oh,
No.
okay. All right.
Unless we just ask Beck to present first, if you don't mind, Beck, and see.
Yeah.
Maybe log off and come back on, Julianne. We'll see if that works when you come back on.
That'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Beck.
Yeah. Thank you, Beck. That is working well.
Alrighty, so today I'd like to discuss the policy and advocacy work that led to the development of a national action plan for endometriosis and then funding for the Endozone project. So before we start, I'll just give you a little bit of information about endometriosis. So it is a long-term inflammatory condition where deposits of tissue that are similar to the lining of the uterus are found outside of the uterus, such as on the bowel, bladder, or ovaries. New research just out last week indicates that endometriosis affects 1 in 7 women and those assigned female at birth. On average, it takes 6.4 years between first symptom presentation to diagnosis. And symptoms vary between people, so some can experience quite a lot of pain, whilst others might not have any pain at all, but their fertility may be affected. It is a chronic disease that doesn't yet have a cure, and it's estimated that the total economic impact of endometriosis on the Australian economy in financial year 2018 was around $7.4 billion. Now, this includes burden of disease, direct healthcare costs, and productivity losses. So just a little bit of context around endometriosis advocacy in Australia. We're quite lucky in Australia. We do have a number of endometriosis associations and support groups. And the 6 main groups are on your screen. So they include EndoActive, Endometriosis Australia, Endo Health, Endometriosis Western Australia, Pelvic Pain Foundation of Australia, and Quendo. Now, these groups provide a lot of different services. They include things such as patient meetups, schools, workplace, and mentoring programs. They also undertake an important role in advocacy and fundraising activities within our community, and they also support our research that we conduct in Australia. So the development of the National Action Plan for endometriosis was quite an organic process. There were a number of activities that aligned at the right time to provide the context for change. So we had strong advocacy efforts from the larger endometriosis associations, and they already had established connections with researchers and ministers, both locally and nationally. A number of politicians at the time had a personal connection with the disease through a family member or friend, which led to some of these politicians discussing endometriosis in Parliament. We also had quite a vocal endometriosis community, and they were wanting their condition to be recognised as a chronic disease, and more people were sharing their story publicly in the media. Researchers and clinicians had also established strong collaborations, both nationally and internationally, in the previous decades, and that was in order to pool their resources to investigate this quite under-researched condition. So this all kind of culminated, all of the stars aligned in 2017 with the Parliamentary Friends of Endometriosis Awareness Group launching. Now, this group had representation from both political parties. So they worked with 5 larger endometriosis associations in Australia at the time, and they sought to really advocate on behalf of people with endometriosis. They encouraged the groups to form one voice for people with endometriosis in Australia, which later became known as the Australian Coalition for Endometriosis. Now, at the launch event for the Parliamentary Friends Group, Minister Hunt issued an apology to people who live with endometriosis and announced that his government was going to work on developing the first national action plan for endometriosis. This plan became one of many of the national action plans to be launched by this particular government. And in 2018, there were a series of roundtable discussions and consultations involving all of the different advocacy groups, researchers, and specialists in endometriosis to set about discussing the priorities for the plan. And it was quite a quick turnaround time. So the plan was drafted, and then there was a public consultation, and the plan was later launched in July 2018. At the same time, a national endometriosis steering group was formed to advise on the implementation of the plan, which sat alongside the policy area that was responsible for implementing the plan. And this particular steering group consisted of researchers, endometriosis associations, and clinicians. So the National Action Plan for Endometriosis focused on 3 key priority areas, and this included things like awareness and education, clinical management and care, and research. And since launching the plan in 2018, the government has committed approximately 87 million to address the significant burden of endometriosis in Australia. And this has been split across the 3 priority areas, and it's provided funding for activities such as targeted MRFF calls, a development of a national endometriosis registry, clinical guidelines and training for clinicians, delivery of schools programs across Australia, and 20 specialised GP clinics. Now, these are just quite a small selection of the activities that were funded under the plan. So if you are interested in more details, you can scan the QR code that's on your screen. And this will take you to the Department of Health and Aged Care Endometriosis Report, which provides a more full listing of all of the different funded activities and where things are up to at the moment. So now I wanted to outline sort of how this advocacy and policy environment led to the endometriosis research group at the Robinson Research Institute obtaining funding to develop Endozone. So the endometriosis research group is led by Professor Hull. And over the years, she's collaborated with researchers both nationally and internationally and had established connections with the endometriosis groups based in Australia and New Zealand. So Professor Hull was one of the people that were invited to the roundtable discussions and consultation workshops that were held when the National Action Plan for Endometriosis was being developed. And it was sort of during these discussions that the idea first formed that there needed to be some sort of way to connect community, clinicians, and researchers in the endo space in order to support the National Action Plan for Endometriosis. So around the same time that the plan was being drafted, in 2018, Robinson Research Institute held an initial stakeholder meeting. And we invited researchers, clinicians, IT staff, and endometriosis associations to discuss the draft National Action Plan for Endometriosis and start to work together to sort of really workshop some of the ideas that we could implement in order to address some of the priorities of the plan. So following this discussion, we put together a proposal for a digital health platform for endometriosis, which later became known as Endozone. We sought and were provided letters of support from each of the endo associations in Australia to support our proposal. And then working with these associations, we pitched our idea to the government and received funding from the Australian Government Department of Health and Jean House for Women's Health in order to begin to develop the platform. So once we'd received our funding, 2020 was all about consultation to find out what the challenges were for people in the endometriosis community and to begin to develop our ideas. Working with SRA, our IT development company, we began to map out the specs and build the platform. And we ran testing in 2021 and 2022 and launched the platform on the 31st of March to coincide with Endometriosis Awareness Month. So the development of Endozone was governed by a series of groups. We had the project leadership group, which was chaired by Professor Hull, and this group provided the overall leadership for the project, oversaw the implementation of the research plan, and it included researchers, clinicians, and health informatics specialists. The project management team, which is the one that I coordinate, undertakes the day-to-day management of the project and general operational aspects of the project. And we also had a stakeholder advisory group. Now, this group included all of the people that came to that first brainstorming meeting we had about the project and included endo associations, clinicians, and researchers. And their role was really to provide advice from the perspective of the consumer and health professionals, facilitate engagement with these groups, and contribute to the co-creation of the platform. We also allocated the equivalent of 0.1 FTE for each of the endometriosis groups to be involved in the project. So how were the endo groups involved? Well, they became paid members of our stakeholder advisory group. They engaged the community and assisted us with recruitment. They attended our community focus groups. They contributed to ideas generation and the design workshops that we held in developing the platform. They also assisted us with user testing of the platform, promoting the platform to the community once we had launched it, and also assisted with helping us obtain funding for phase 2 and advocacy work around this project. So I just wanted to take you briefly through the co-creation process that we use for Endozone. So I guess at the heart of this project was putting the community first. So we used the design thinking framework to really guide this co-creation process. And this is a methodology for creative problem solving that was developed at Stanford University. So the first 2 stages, empathize and define, are really about learning about the challenges or problems that people with endometriosis face. And we use workshops and focus groups to really explore these challenges with the community. So our focus groups included people experiencing symptoms, those diagnosed with endometriosis, and their supporters, so parents and partners. Once we'd had that information, we got everybody together and we started to sort of develop our ideas in order to target some of the challenges people were experiencing. So unfortunately, we were in the middle of COVID, so we did have to do this all electronically. So we held some virtual brainstorming workshops with our stakeholder group and consumer priorities surveys in order to begin to prioritize the ideas for the platform. Prototype and testing was the fun bit. We started to implement some of these ideas and then test them with our user group. So we did this through design surveys, again, getting that community feedback, and user testing through community members and some of our stakeholders. And this process was really quite key to the successful deployment of Endozone, as very little changes were required during the prototype and testing phases prior to our launch. So to ensure we're delivering what the community wanted, we embedded a series of focus groups and surveys into the co-creation process. So we had our initial focus groups with the community, and then having that information, we then conducted some virtual brainstorming sessions with our stakeholder advisory group. And these people were clinicians, endo associations, and researchers. So electronically, we got them together on a Zoom call. We divided the group into 2, and they were given a series of challenges that we'd obtained from the focus groups, a time limit, and they were asked to generate as many ideas as possible in order to address some of those challenges the community were experiencing. So they came up with 149 ideas, which we then asked them to prioritize through an online survey. And this gave us a short list of ideas that we then took back to the community and asked people to identify their most important priority area. And this survey was distributed through the endo associations, and we had 347 people complete the survey. And you can see on the slide there that the 3 most important priorities were improving doctors' education and communication on endo, addressing normalization of period pain, and pain management. So whilst this was useful and it fed into our co-creation process, it was also a useful survey to demonstrate to the government that we were directly addressing the priorities from the community. It was a great low-cost way to understand the needs of the community that you're serving and to build your research projects around addressing these priorities. So now that we had a pretty good understanding about what the community wanted, we worked with our IT development company to develop a series of prototype screens. And these are some of the early screens that you can see on the slide. So we tested these prototypes with our stakeholders and user testing group, which consisted primarily of people with endometriosis, the endo associations, and also some supporters such as parents and partners. So these screens made up some of the information in our early mock-ups of the homepage. We learned from our focus groups that people really wanted to find the information that was unique to their circumstances. So we did that through easy to use menu bars, subsections for different audiences, and informatics to get the user the right information at the right time. So during our testing process, the feedback was generally positive. They did make some suggestions to minor modifications in the design and imagery of the platform, and that enabled us to build the full platform. Once we had a working platform, we invited our user testing group back to complete a series of tasks on the platform. So they used our symptom checker, using our search tool, and also navigating through the homepage for specific information. Again, the feedback was quite positive. We did make some minor changes to some of the placement of icons and functionality of the search tool. So we launched Endozone on the 31st of March 2022, and in keeping with our different audiences, we have info for people with endometriosis, their supporters, and clinicians. Since launching, we've had 45,000 visitors to the platform, and Australia continues to be our biggest user base, as this is where we focus most of our marketing efforts. But we are now starting to see a bit more of a global reach, with New Zealand, UK, and US users beginning to access the platform. So I wanted to share with you some key learnings from this project. So co-creation at times can be quite challenging. It often takes much longer than you think, but it's well worth it. As they say, 2 heads, or in our case, 14 heads, are better than 1. If the research team were responsible for designing Endozone, I think we would have ended up with a very different product. And to be honest, I'm not sure the community would have liked it as much. Involving everyone in the co-creation process from the beginning meant that when we took our designs and then our prototype to the community, we really only needed to make minor changes at that end testing stage. In engaging in this type of project, the goal should really be those long-term relationships between community and researchers, rather than just a focus on this one project. So the endo associations have supported a number of our other endometriosis projects, and we've also been able to assist them with undertaking their own research and publishing findings. In terms of working with the community groups, some lessons that we've learned are they are much better at advocacy and connecting us with the right people than we will ever be as researchers. Their contribution to our projects are valuable, and therefore they should be paid for their work. Many of these associations are volunteer-based. They're best engaged right at the early idea stage of the project, and the reason for that is they can contribute to your proposal, they can help with advocacy work in order to drum up interest in your project, and then they can take ownership with you in this project. So involving these groups provides you with a very unique perspective. It ensures that the research is translational, both for the community, but also for the policy areas. In terms of working with the government, be proactive and engage with various people in the government, including ministers, their advisors, and the policy areas that are associated with your research. Try to engage regularly so that you're top of mind. And this can be as simple as offering to present on some of the priority areas they're interested in, providing statistics or access to research articles, participating in consultation processes for any strategy documents that are coming up, and then also letting them know of the success of your research. So whether that be acceptance at conferences, sending them copies of posters or articles is a useful way to sort of start that engagement process. One thing we've learned is it's important to engage quite regularly. There's often turnover in staff or restructuring, and relationships need to be maintained. Often the unit that's responsible for administering your grant will be different than the policy area that is associated with your research. So it's really important that you start to engage with both of these units, particularly in relation to providing reports or outcomes from your research. And less is more. So this is one I learned as a senior policy officer in the Queensland government. Part of my role included managing the research projects and tenders and writing ministerial briefings. So I received some beautiful reports from the researchers that we'd contracted for our projects. However, a ministerial briefing consists of about 3 to 5 dot points. It was my role to extract these salient dot points from the often lengthy reports that I'd received. So make it easy for the policy team or minister's advisors to find these salient points in your outputs. Have a summary at the front with call out boxes of key statistics to make that process easier. You can also offer to be a contact should they need some quick stats to support ministerial briefings or speeches. There are loads of alternative funding sources, and these can include things like tenders for research or evaluation, or engaging directly with the minister's office or policy team, as they have a portfolio budget aligned with national strategies or action plans that they manage. And this is how Endozone was funded. It was through a targeted grant under the Public Health and Chronic Disease Program area. So how can you implement what we've discussed today? A couple of key ideas is to think about any community or advocacy groups that align with your research. Check if there's a parliamentary friends group that aligns with your work and reach out to them, or offer to present at their meetings. Do a quick search through government records, looking for strategy documents or action plans that might align with your work, and then look at how your research can address their key priorities, and include this in your proposal or grant. Identify your state or federal minister that looks after the portfolio that most closely aligns with your research, and meet with them or their team. Co-create your research from the beginning. In terms of next steps for Endozone, we were successful in receiving another grant for phase 2 of the project, again funded under the Public Health and Chronic Disease Program. All of the initial groups that we worked with in the initial phase are joining us for phase 2. So we've recently held our 2 stakeholder workshops and are starting to develop a work plan of priorities that came out of these workshops. And that's what we'll be extrapolating on in phase 2 of this project. So I'd like to acknowledge the Endozone team led by Professor Hull and our collaborators from each of the Endo associations. A special mention to Marcus Goddard, the former business manager at RRI. He was quite instrumental in working with the government and our team to secure funding for this project. You can check out Endozone by scanning the QR code. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Beck. That was great. Something that came out quite strong from what you were talking about is the importance of relationships, relationships with those advocacy groups, with other clinicians or researchers, relationships with government, and staying in regular contact, because you never know when those relationships are going to pay off. Not that that's, a good reason to make relationships, but really it's bringing people together to create something more than you can as individuals. And also about, as a researcher, you might not always be the right person to advocate. So if you've got the right team around you, you're going to be more successful. So thanks so much for sharing your learnings with us. Julianne, over to you. Let's see if it's going to work this time.
Okay, let's fingers crossed.
Yes.
Okay, I think we can.
Beautiful.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you. And I think that many of the things that Beck touched on, I will reinforce going through this. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Camaragal lands of the Eora Nation in North Sydney. And so I extend my I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on, and pay respects to elders past and present and emerging, and certainly also extend that respect to any First Nations people that are on the meeting today. So my focus is really to talk about a campaign that we ran in 2019, which was to put heart health back on the public agenda. It had been languishing for over 10 years, and we needed to do something to change it up. In order to do that, I'm just going to touch quite briefly on government relations. And I think Beck has already touched on some of the essential things you need to know when engaging with government. So consider this a bit of a refresher to that. Okay, so I guess if you ask 10 people to define advocacy, you'll get 10 different responses. It's complex, it's a special art, there are no set rules, its benefits can be far-reaching to both communities and individuals. It's certainly not for the faint-hearted. You need passion, but you also need persistence and patience. Certainly a knowledge of politics is helpful, but as Beck talked to, community action experience is equally important and an important ingredient in your strategy. Budgets can help, but expertise, credibility, clear communication, and strong partners are equally essential. You need to know your stuff. You may know all the fine detail, but you have to be able to hone your arguments in a 2-minute spiel to different audiences, keep your killer facts close, and have a 10-minute presentation ready to go at a moment's notice if the minister calls or some other highly influential commentator. I think most of us dread the media, but it actually can be your friend to sharpen arguments, amplify messages, provide insight to your particular issue, and certainly allow a platform for those with the lived experience to tell their story. Most advocacy strategies are layered. Reliance on evidence alone will never be enough. And as Beck has mentioned, and I'm sure others have, timing is everything. So just a quick overview. As many of you know, Australia is a mixed system of government. We vote for a member of parliament to act on our behalf. We follow the Westminster system in that the powers of government are separated to act as checks and balances on those powers. We have legislators in the form of Parliament who have the power to make and change laws. We have an executive government who has the power to put those laws into action. And then we have the judiciary, the courts and the judges who make independent judgments on those laws. We have 3 tiers of government: federal, state and territory, and local councils, and each is responsible for different state-facing, national-facing or local-facing issues and responsibilities. In turn, that means that laws can be different in different jurisdictions. The Commonwealth is far-reaching, it's national-facing, states and territories are towards their own jurisdiction, and then local councils also have power to make rules and regulations. And I've listed here some of those laws. So in any given cycle of government, there are opportunities to influence. At a federal level, elections are held every 3 years. At state and territory level, it's every 4 years. Over that phase or a cycle of government, there are critical moments to engage. Pre-election, this is where political parties are working up their election platforms and set policies for their next contest. And these can start 18 months out before the next election. So it's important that you are in advocating, prosecuting your arguments to both sides of the political spectrum. Election campaigns are clearly an important opportunity, great for announcing commitments and also seeking bipartisan support on an issue. And because they're under pressure, there is a tendency that they may come on board. Budgets and pre-budget phases are also important. Most budgets are handed down mid-year, but a call for proposal usually happens, or costed proposals usually happens in around January, February of each year. So this is where researchers can really help in putting together or assisting in putting together business cases for your particular issue or activity. So it's a critical time in the cycle and a great way of putting your arguments and your costed programs before Treasury. As Beck talked to, it's also important to develop strong relationships, not only with those ministers that are in power of the government of the day, but also the opposition. But equally important, you need to be also looking at the rising star MPs, because they are the decision makers of the future. And if you know their backstory, their passion, it may serve you or your organisation well into the future. Parliamentary friendship groups are a significant friend to any advocate. They're usually grouped around topics of interest, and members are made up from the Greens, Liberal Party, Nationals, Labor. So it is cross-functional in that way, a great way to work out who's passionate about your issue and to look for opportunities to co-host events. And finally, it's important to build your organisation's reputation as a trusted source of information to bureaucrats, ministers, advisors, and even the media. You know, if they contact you, they're about to go on, you know, Q&A and they need some fast facts, be responsive, be helpful, and you will be remembered. So they're important things to remember when building your relationships with government. And so, sorry, it's not moving forward. So just to recap, it's important that when planning your advocacy strategy, know which level of government, ministerial department, or advisor that you intend to deal with. Know which policy, legislation, regulation, or national state strategy relates to your issue. Think about where government is in its current cycle and whether you've tailored your actions accordingly. Who might be champions for your cause in government, the opposition, or the crossbench? And how have efforts to change the laws or actions in your area gone in the past? What has happened? Was it unsuccessful? If so, why? And how can you address this? So let me now pivot to our experience in running a 2019 advocacy campaign. As you're aware, heart disease is a leading cause of death in Australia, and many forms of heart disease can be prevented or managed if detected early enough. Heart health checks are performed by GPs and involve a 20-minute assessment where your doctor will talk to you about your family history, any clinical risk factors you may have, and your lifestyle to determine your own personal risk of heart disease. If problems are detected, then your doctor may recommend lifestyle changes, medication, or further tests. There's a set eligibility criteria. However, uptake of heart health checks in the community is low, and screening tends to be done on an ad hoc basis. Cost is certainly a major barrier to people having heart health checks because it's not on the NBS item or not on the NBS scheme, and accessibility to general practice is also a major concern. A comprehensive primary care CVD screening program would certainly address many of these issues, but political commitment to change this has been to this time and date quite hesitant. So our challenge in 2019 was how we were going to change this up. Uptake of heart health checks at the time was still suboptimal, with only an estimated 40% of the eligible population presenting for a heart health check. Research showed that overtreatment of those at low risk was quite notable, while undertreatment of those at high risk, particularly for high blood pressure and high cholesterol, was also of great concern. Both the UK and New Zealand had demonstrated that integrated approaches to CVD assessment was efficient and effective in lowering population risk. But here in Australia, the prevailing view was one of complacency. For 10 years, the Heart Foundation had advocated to the federal government to get heart health checks on the NBS, and subsequently, we also advocated to update the 2012 CVD guidelines as they became more and more out of date. But our efforts up until 2019 had been largely unsuccessful. Nonetheless, it was a 2019 election year, and so that offered us an opportunity. What we needed was a clever idea to get heart health back on the national agenda. And so our idea was to tap into Australians' fascination with true crime and position heart disease as Australia's worst serial killer, striking the lives of 51 Australians every day. We didn't have massive funds, and so we planned to run a social media campaign and partner with a news corporation that had extensive reach into every part of Australia. Our intent was to raise the personal relevance of heart disease so that if it wasn't personally relevant to you, it might be to your sister, brother, father, mother, friend, or neighbour. Our timing was to use the start of the federal election to initiate public discussion and then come in with a push on key policy asks to politicians. Our focus was the federal health minister and the opposition, and our desired response was really to shock Australians into action. Our public call to action was for people to complete a new 2-minute online heart age calculator, and to policy makers and politicians, it was to adopt 7 actions to stop this serial killer in its tracks. And so you may recall seeing this back in 2019. It was entitled Australia's Biggest Serial Killer, and it was a campaign that ran for 8 weeks. We partnered with News Corp and launched on the 17th of February in 2019. That Sunday, we had wraparounds of every Sunday paper in the country with a branded message that Australia's worst serial killer was on the run, taking 51 victims every day. Inside were long-form articles written by medical reporter Sue Dunleavy and others. There were stats, facts, personal stories, interviews, calls for action, as well as direction to the Heart Foundation landings page for further information. Our commitment to the true crime theme was comprehensive. If we were going to do this, we needed to make it as seamless as possible. And so we engaged police detectives, crime writers, true crime podcast facilitators and hosts to really build out this story of Australia's worst serial killer. And so that also covered to our spokespeople. So for instance, our cardiologists were suddenly expert witnesses in this unsolved mystery. We had detectives, we had victims, we had survivors, all telling their story. And to add to that, we ran a social media campaign in which, long form stories were told about people's experience of heart disease, but also encouragement to complete our heart age calculator. Various forms of digital advertising were used across, social media platforms over that 8-week period, really raising awareness of just, how deadly this disease is and how many forms it takes in the community. Our 7-point call to action to politicians was first and foremost to fund heart health checks on the Medicare system. Secondly, to update our GP guidelines that were now 10 years out of date, to boost investment into cardiac rehab, end rheumatic heart disease, support a national women and heart disease campaign, fund a tobacco control mass media campaign because one hadn't been run for a number of years, and to develop a national nutrition strategy and funded action plan. The public call to action was to complete the heart age calculator. This was new for the Heart Foundation. In fact, we had to fast-track our development of it to have it ready in time for the launch of this campaign. It was essentially a motivational tool to communicate risk in a more personally relevant way. We'd seen calculators used internationally, but they'd not been done on a large scale here in Australia. And so if you've done the heart age calculator, you'll know it's 7 questions. It takes about 2 minutes to complete, and it will tell you what your heart age is, or your estimated heart age, against your actual age. Certainly the research has shown that using tools like this have increased recall and emotional impact, and really encourage people to seek out further information and support. And so in the interest of time, I will speed up now. What was the impact of our strategy? Well, in the first 2 days, we got more than 1,600 stories generated over TV, print, and radio. In the first 48 hours, over 100,000 people completed the heart age calculator. Now, we'd estimated that if we could get 35,000 people over a 6-week period, that would be great. But the response was phenomenal. And by week 5, over 250,000 people had completed the heart age calculator. Hits to our website were astronomical. They increased by 300%. And pleasingly, the public responded well to the creative. We were concerned, you always have a concern when you do something different. It may be risky, it may have unintended consequences, but in this case, people responded well to the true crime treatment of our creative. Many were also surprised by that heart disease was still the #1 killer. And in terms of health professionals, certainly public health organisations were supportive, but there was a small section of the general practitioners who believed heart health screening was already being done well in the community and it didn't need to be on the MBS. There's no doubt that the politicians felt under pressure nonetheless. And so did that action and that high-risk strategy result in an outcome? Well, yes, 2 of the 7 policy asks were delivered. Within 1 week of the launch, we had bipartisan support to put heart health checks on the MBS schedule. We also had the coalition commit to $1 million to update the 2012 CVD assessment guidelines. Labor also during the campaign committed to allocating $25 million to RHD, but didn't win the government or didn't win the day, so that funding never materialised. And in the dying days of the former coalition government, $800,000 was allocated to really do some scoping work around a national nutrition strategy. So was it worth it? Well, I think while it was a high-risk strategy, it also was a calculated manoeuvre. We had contingency plans built into the program that if it did go pear-shaped or if we did get a negative reaction, we could pull the campaign and pivot to a secondary campaign that was much more neutral in its messaging, well, neutral in its appeal. But, I'd have to say that past efforts at playing safe during the 2010, 2013 and 2016 elections had not produced a result for us, and we really did need to change it up. Leveraging a true crime genre certainly had appeal and was different. The heart age calculator was a simple action that helped people put heart disease front of mind, and it certainly generated a lot of conversations, and we certainly saw that back through our helpline. It re-energised some of our partnerships with others and certainly allowed us to reset the bar with primary health networks and nurse-based organisations. It raised a few eyebrows that we were partnering with News Corp and not Fairfax. But to be honest, the reach and readership of News Corp fitted our demographic much better. It certainly raised the ire of some GPs once the MBS reimbursement fee was announced, which was quite modest, around $78. They thought the Heart Foundation had negotiated that fee as part of our advocacy strategy, which was not the case. But we did have to do some follow-up work to really make that absolutely clear to general practitioners. And to be fair, Minister Hunt did put us in the cool room for a few months after the election. So, that again was calculated, built into our calculations, but still, after that time, the thawing did start. So what's been the impact 4 years on? Well, heart health checks have been extended on for a further 12 months on the MBS. There is a review going on at the moment, and we wait to see what the outcome of that will be. There's been almost 500,000 heart health checks lodged since the introduction of the MBS item. And so that's giving us quite a rich database to look at who is having heart health checks, what is that telling us about where they're being done, and what things should we be doing to tweak that. So it's not comprehensive, but it is a way of measuring the uptake of heart health checks across the country. The CVD guideline, or risk assessment guideline, has been updated, as has the calculator that underscores it, and that was launched in 2023 with $1 million further secured from the federal government to assist in guideline dissemination. During the intervening time, separate investment has also been made into general practice to standardise heart health information through the free availability of a GP toolkit. We've trialled text-based heart health invitations via GP clinics to those eligible, and found that that is a viable method of encouraging people to come in for a heart health check. We've also run, or the Heart Foundation has run, geo-targeted mini heart health campaigns in areas of low uptake. Definitely stronger relationships have been built with the Commonwealth health departments, certainly in the chronic disease area, and with those responsible for the MBS. And our advocacy, or everyone's advocacy, for a national CVD and chronic disease screening program continues. And so what were our learnings? Well, back to that magical, mercurial thing called timing, the volatility of the 2019 election campaign gave us a window of opportunity. We had bipartisan support in 1 week, which we hadn't been able to achieve in 10 years. So certainly timing played its part. The element of surprise also worked. You know, for 10 years, we'd been using the same arguments, meeting with the same people. So the information was not new. But in the 2019 campaign, our vehicle of delivery was. The crime theme certainly refreshed our messages and allowed us to present our arguments in a different way, using different commentators and speakers. And I would have to say that the engagement of a large-scale media organisation certainly brought a new rigour to our advocacy strategy. They were very strict on lead time planning, alternate strategies, and interrogation of our arguments. We had many meetings with the News Corp staff, challenging us, asking us for evidence to support our claims, and to really refine and hone our messages. So it was certainly valuable to the Heart Foundation at that time and the staff at that time to really be tested on those arguments. Early mobilisation with our partners was also critical, because there were interviews being done in prep for the launch, weeks out. And similarly, we needed independent third-party people to be briefing journalists, giving them information, talking to the ministers' offices and advisors about, issues that were still running in the background, and pressure testing ideas. And I think, it's fair to say that to land the MBS item and the guideline was always our key objective. But by having other policy asks in the mix, really built out the relevance of why heart disease was such a pernicious, everywhere serial killer type condition. And so it allowed us to tell a bigger story about heart disease than just about heart disease screening or early detection. And so in conclusion, I would say that navigating the advocacy terrain can be like a cross-country hike. You know the landmarks, but the conditions can change in an instant. So if ever in doubt, or if ever you're in a position where you're planning an advocacy strategy, then this list of 8 questions from the Western Australian Public Health Association are good ones to test for yourself in framing your strategy. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I have got a list of additional information and resources there should you want to become a full-time advocate. I can certainly recommend the short courses, some of these mentoring programs, and certainly Simon Chapman, as a experienced advocator, has some good tips and advice on how to run an advocacy campaign. So thank you, Sarah, and
Thank you, Julianne.
Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. That was great. There was lots of synergies between yours and Beck's examples, even though they're very different topics. It's great to see that the campaign was so successful, even if it was a bit risky. And thanks for stepping us through your strategy, where, you know, who you were targeting, the timing, and having those 7 clear point, like, call to action. It's, like you said, having the main calls, but then these follow-on ones, should the government be interested in following up. I haven't seen any questions pop up. If we've got a few minutes left, if anyone, oh, hang on, here's a question pop up right now. Rebecca Perry, she's said, fantastic presentations, thank you. And I believe Beck has tuned out now, but if you, Julianne, could comment on how to make connections with ministers' advisors, especially when you note that staff can turn over frequently. Do you have any guidance there, please?
Yeah, look, I think that you really have to triangulate your relationships. So there's often a view that you need to focus on the minister's office. I would suggest, and having been a bureaucrat in the past, it's equally important to engage with the department and the policy advisors in the department, because often they're briefing the advisors in the minister's office. So not only concentrate your efforts on the minister's advisors, but also look to the departments and the policy advisors in those departments, because they will be feeding a lot of information across the aisle to the minister's office. I think that it is always useful to have done detailed backgrounds on your minister, on who the chief of staff is, and who are the advisors. It's true, turnover now is quite rapid, but don't put all your eggs in the one basket. As Beck talked about, it's not only the health minister you need to be engaging with. You know, if your issue is also has a large financial piece to it, you need to be talking to members of Treasury. You need to be looking at whether there's a junior minister that's assisting on cancer or women's health, or who may be looking for an opportunity to champion your cause, or, you know, argue up independently of the senior minister. So look broadly, and you know, in my experience, it's useful to have a running dossier of who the ministers are, what their original maiden speech was, because that gives you insight into the issues that they are interested in and want to prosecute in Parliament or in government. So yeah, I'll stop rambling there, but I think be comprehensive in your approach and look at the portfolios they've held in the past, because that also may give you a way in.
Yeah, great, thank you. I thought it was interesting, the partnership with News Corp. Is that a common thing that no? And so is that something that other groups should strive to achieve, or it was a bit of a golden opportunity for you?
Look, I think the stars aligned at that particular time. And, you know, that's not to say you shouldn't, because, you know, what I would say is that through their regional papers at that time, we had a reach into the community that we had never had before.
Yeah, fantastic.
So, you know, we were really throwing everything at this campaign because, as I said, 3 cycles of federal elections had not produced zip, really.
Mm.
And we really needed to change it up. It also served as a reminder to the Australian public that heart disease was still out there and still an issue to be passionate about. So it served an advocacy objective, but it also served a broader objective for the Heart Foundation in raising our profile again in the community, certainly looking for opportunities to donate, but also to showcase what the current issues were as a headline to really what the state of chronic disease is in Australia.
Yeah, fantastic. Oh, well, thank you so much for answering those questions, Julianne. That brings us to the close for today. So I just wanted to thank you again, Julianne and Beck, who Beck's no longer online, but your experience has really provided inspiration. And I think there's a lot of food for thought out of both of your presentations. So thank you. Next week will be the last webinar of the week, and it's actually a practical session, which isn't something we usually do. So Associate Professor Carmel Williams, she's going to assist attendees. It's going to be an online workshop in how to turn your research into a policy document. So if you're interested in coming along to that, there'll be some online breakout rooms. And please bring along a bit of research that you're either starting on or intending on working on, or some findings. And she'll be able to give some guidance as to turn that into a policy document and something you're going to be able to walk away with. And so that's it for today. Thanks all for tuning in, and I'll stop sharing that. Oh, and also, Julianne, I'll share your resources on social media as well. So thank you both. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you later.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye.